Hello and welcome to the Try Mechanics podcast. This podcast is going off on a slightly different tangent to what I've been discussing recently. This is all about time-restricted eating and how it relates to the athlete. So I've been asked recently a few different questions related to time-restricted feeding or time-restricted eating and how not only can you apply them being an athlete and how do they apply to athletes as opposed to the general population, but also whether there's anything else that could be gained by using this kind of strategy as an athlete and how it might relate to things like the microbiome and how it might relate to other things like injury and various other facets that essentially athletes struggle with or have problems with that the general population might not. So if you haven't listened to any of my podcasts before, you haven't heard me discussing about what time-restricted eating actually is, just a brief overview. It is a distinctly different thing from intermittent fasting you might have come across. The key thing about time-restricted eating is that it's all related, or the majority of the research is really related to circadian rhythm. The idea being that we are meant to eat at certain times during the day. Our body is set up, our metabolism is set up for eating at certain times of the day. Now, I think I have to start this off by apologising really, in that over the last few years or so, I think I had moved towards the idea that maybe we don't need to eat breakfast. I think that's partly due to the fact that I was never particularly hungry in the morning. A lot of athletes that I worked with found that they were essentially trying to cram in breakfast when they weren't particularly hungry. And it led to kind of the belief that a lot of that came from out of kind of bodybuilding and weightlifting that actually maybe you don't need to eat breakfast, and maybe actually the body is better off if you don't eat breakfast and eat later on during the day. And this was then started the kind of intermittent fasting craze. Typically, kind of like the general or the general ideal, or the most popular was the kind of not eating till about lunchtime, and then eating between about lunch and 8 o'clock. Now, the thing about this was that it was designed to try and maximise gains from bodybuilding. So it was meant to maximise growth hormone. So by having insulin low for a long period of time, you could increase growth hormone, you'd increase fat burning and fat loss. And the idea was that you'd then weight lift or do something similar, exercise around midday or just before midday, and then eat just afterwards. And it seemed to have good success in bodybuilders because it maximised the kind of fat burning effect they were after to become lean or and a lot of these practices, you've got to remember, are related to bodybuilders who are trying to look good on a stage. So it's not necessarily about being healthy, it is about being as lean as possible whilst maintaining the kind of level of muscle mass that they're after. And the same doesn't really apply when you're an athlete in terms of endurance sports. But the key thing is that I always felt better. And I think I started to notice a lot more problems related to things like digestion and heartburn and things I'd never really had a problem with before. And things like sleep started to change. It's partly because I was eating most of my calories later on towards the day and finding that I essentially wasn't really digesting things particularly well. I do want to mention about that. There's this idea, or it's not really an idea, it's essentially proven in research that our digestive power, so to speak, starts to peak, or is at its kind of highest in the morning, probably about an hour or two after we wake. And then it gradually wanes during the day as we are eating, as we are using those elements of digestion. And then it starts to decrease very rapidly, particularly towards the evening. And this is related to things like melatonin, because as you start to increase your melatonin production going towards your bedtime, you then get a reduction in your ability to manage insulin and various other elements that controls in terms of blood sugar. So there is that argument. So when time-restricted eating, let's compare the two to intermittent fasting, is time-restricted eating is eating during a shortened window, or a window that is appropriate related to circadian rhythm. And actually, it's not necessarily that short, in that the studies that they did were initially 8 hours, but actually that was driven by the fact that the researcher could only spend 8 hours monitoring these conditions during the lab. And actually, when they repeated the studies for 9, 10, 11 and up to 12 hours in mice and both in humans, the results were essentially replicated. They weren't quite as powerful, particularly when they were dealing with humans with obesity problems, so metabolic syndrome and those side of things, they definitely found that 8 hours was more powerful regards to those. But for the general population, 12 hours was actually about right. Now, the funny thing is that you mention this to people, and they'll instantly say, well, of course I eat within that, because I don't eat essentially that late at night, and I don't really eat in the morning. Often I just have a coffee and go to work. And the problem is that the coffee starts things off, because we're talking about an inbuilt circadian clock here. We're talking about the liver. We're talking about the fact that the initial sensation of the liver of caffeine means what it does is and that happens very rapidly, because we absorb the first part of the caffeine in our essentially the coffee in our mouth, is it tells the liver that we are ready to go on digestion. And that's when things suddenly switch over. So it starts switching over, going from the kind of essentially repair mode that we get when we're fasted into digestion mode, which is what we have in the day. And the problem is we're also eating a relatively higher fat and possibly higher protein meal in the evening, which means that the evening meal, because digestion has slowed by that point anyway, after you go past about 6 or 7 o'clock, digestion becomes so slow that signal that you're fasting might not reach the liver, or might not become apparent until the early hours of the morning. By the time all of that, it might not even happen overnight. A lot of people have found that kind of feeling when they eat a relatively heavy meal. They go out for a late kind of evening meal or a curry or something relatively heavy, and they still feel quite full the next morning. And that's probably because the digestion is shut down so extensively that food is probably still there. So that fasting signal never gets there, and the body never switches into the kind of fasting repair mode. We often have this belief that we repair because of the food that we eat. So we think that we're actually in a state where we are supplying building blocks, and the more building blocks that we supply, the more essentially the better repair we'll get. And that is partly true from the basic sense of things like muscle building as a good example. Providing building blocks is really quite important, as we know, for muscle protein synthesis. But the funny thing is when we look at the muscle protein synthesis in related to diet, it's really about the intake across the day, which starts to beg the question is maybe it isn't about that intake that we take in acutely. It's about how much there is in terms of balance across the day. And then again, this is related to circadian rhythm. And what we tend to find is that actually the more cellular-based recovery and repair occurs when the cellular essentially energy status becomes lower, i.e. we've sent the fat off to package at the fat tissue, and we've stored the glycogen in the place we want to store the glycogen, and now we're at a state where we can start repairing elements of the cell. And that doesn't happen if food is constantly coming in, because the cell needs to use its energy to partition and send that food into the right places. So this is where the idea of time-restricted eating comes in, is that if we reduce the amount of time that we eat to a certain window, particularly related to circadian rhythm, we then open up the opportunity to have a longer fasting window, which means we have a longer recover and repair window. And that's the critical element. And if you think of what you want as an athlete, that recovery window, we're getting all kind of het up about how important recovery is now, because recovery is what's been done by professional athletes for lots of them for a long time. The ones that reach the top tend to put a lot of emphasis on recovery, but it's always been the kind of often cited reason, the difference between elite athletes and non-elite athletes who can maybe be able to train the same amount of time but cannot recover because the non-elite has to go to work, and all these elements. So we know recovery is so important, but we think about recovery as food, as we think about recovery as things like sleep, and obviously sleep is ridiculously important, but so is having a time period where you're not eating that then allows your body to essentially start recovering. And this is where exercise comes in as well, because actually exercise has been called a fasting mimic, because what it can do is it can far more rapidly use up some of those cellular energy sources, which then puts you into that state faster. So the question I had recently, and I've had it off multiple people, is I'm working throughout the day, and so I plan on training after work and then eating after I train. And some people have said they may not eat until 8, 9, or possibly even 10 o'clock. And the key thing about this is how do they implement time restricted feeding into that schedule? Because that's far later than really want to be eating. Because the key thing is that a lot of these changes that were noted with time restricted feeding were far more pronounced, or they were basically far more positive, and possibly in some cases the only time they were positive was when that feeding window was early, because there was issues with when the kind of digestive power went down in the evening that we then couldn't recover properly, and actually that was meaning that window was being basically kept closed because of having to try and digest food overnight in a very slow digestion system, as I've just mentioned. So the critical thing about this is, what do you do about that evening session? And the first thing I'm going to say is maybe that training during the evening is not optimal. And the problem with that is that is how the majority of athletes do train, or the athletes that work do train, is they train that evening block. It probably disrupts our sleep. It probably has a lot of different effects that are really not very positive. And you've got to really question whether you should be doing that training at all. And that's the first thing to put out there. Is there a way you could not do that training? So as a good example, I know people who are on flexible working schedules, and they've changed to to change their working schedule around when they want to train. I know some people who start work at 10 o'clock. That gives them a couple of hours in the morning to sort themselves, train and do what they need to do, then they go to work. I know some other people that also incorporate a 1 to 2 hour lunchtime window. And the only issue with this is when you're in jobs that obviously don't allow that, are very rigid or shift-based, but also if you're in jobs where you have to have meetings at certain times that tend to fit around the middle of the day. However, we now know that forward-thinking companies like Google are implementing certain restricted times during around the middle of the day or the early afternoon where people have to be there. Other than that, they can turn up and they can leave whenever they would like, as long as they get their work done. And so maybe you could think about changing your work schedule if that is possible, so that you could work, let's say you would train in the morning, possibly train at lunchtime if you needed to as well, and then you would work into the early evening and then go home and eat then, as opposed to trying to go home, train and then eat. The other side of things is whether you really do need to eat after those evening sessions, and whether it's beneficial or whether essentially it's just slowing down your ability to recover. The key thing comes back to is what the session actually is. And what you've got the next day is, as quite rightly, if you're doing an intense session in the evening and you've got training you want to do the next day, again, whether you should be doing that intense session in the evening is a slightly different point. But you probably are going to need to have something to recover. Now, in that situation, maybe you either pre-eat before the session a little more, so actually you have your essentially 1 or 2 hours before the session, you have either a small meal or something you can tolerate doing the session on, but you then feel like you don't have to massively rush out and eat straight away after, or eat anything at all after the session. Or maybe after the session you have something extremely rapidly absorbed. And I used this in the past, this technique, when I was doing this, in that sometimes I was training and I was training till about 7 to 8 o'clock, which would be the top end of my eating window. I tend to never go past 8 o'clock because it often gives me problems in terms of refluxing later on in the night. But I would actually have a protein shake. I'd have all the things, protein shake with a little bit of carbohydrates, something relatively simple and quickly absorbed. And I'd have it with me, next to me on the bike. And I would actually drink it whilst I was warming down. So I'm getting it all straight in there, straight away, whilst I'm still exercising, so that essentially that I get everything in the right place, but also so that I am not getting off the bike, showering, mobilising or doing anything else off the bike, cooking for a while and all these kind of things. And so that's a very good use of things like protein powders. That's where they can really come in handy. But what you've got to do is you've got to make sure that the meals in the day replace what you would have lost in terms of that evening meal. So you have and I've said this to people, if they are going to train that way, then maybe they consider essentially switching meals. They have their dinner, essentially the dinner style food for lunch, and maybe a little more basically breakfast and lunch, and then they have their training. They essentially have maybe a snack or something before their training, and then they stop then. So that's one way of approaching it. The other thing I just want to touch on is how time-restricted feeding may be really important if you are injured. Again, it goes back to this idea that we often think about injury and injury food and recovery as being what can we put into the system. But what if, again, the same thing applies? And there is a little bit of evidence. If you start joining the dots, now there's been nothing directly tested on this, and this is something that I would personally like to try and test possibly during my masters over the next year, if I can work it into working with the microbiome, which is what my masters is going to be based on, is whether you can actually gain a benefit in terms of injury recovery, by fasting or by having a significant period each day where you're not eating that allows you to essentially repair those tissues. Because maybe, and this is a kind of hypothesis that's coming out from two different directions, things like tendon injuries may not be related really to the local the problem with what you've actually done to that tendon. It might just be a case that the whole body is relatively inflamed and that you've tipped it over the edge, or that you have damage in those areas, and by the whole body being inflamed means that that's where you're feeling things. So actually that's to put it on a slightly different spin on things, and that actually maybe elongating this time restricting feeding out, because it's become anecdotal. People have gone on water fasts where they haven't eaten for a day or two. Their joints seem to improve. They seem to notice their aches and pains have gone down, and these things, and that part starts to paint that same picture. Unfortunately, there isn't anything directly in research at the moment to really back that up, because it's a hypothesis. But it would make a lot of sense. And what I like to think about these things is that so much of what we look into in terms of science, when it comes to nutrition, when it comes to sports and things, have been traditionally done by athletes, by traditional cultures for a long period of time. And it's now we're finally getting around to actually studying it. It's very rare actually where science produces a whole new idea and hypothesis that hasn't been done practically somewhere by someone, by a coach or athlete. So I want you to think about that, is actually maybe it's worth testing these ideas out to see whether it has an impact on you. And the key thing, again, going back to time-restricted eating, is that as athletes, we do tend to use eating as part of our essentially almost coping strategy. I've heard it said about people like the Brownie brothers that they never really addressed the kind of nutrition side of things because it was viewed as the bit their allowance because they trained so hard. Now, the key thing is that as athletes, we often don't have the best diets. Part of the motivation for what I'm going to be doing in terms of my research is the fact that actually, as athletes, we tend to have this slight distortion towards lots of processed carbohydrates, sugars, and various other things, because we often use training as an excuse to eat them. Plus, whilst we're out and about and training and eating, I mean, you just have to look at almost all sports nutrition, even the so-called paleo garbage that's there, which I can't stand. I honestly can't stand these idea of these paleo bars. I think they're absolutely ridiculous because most of them are made out of 50-60% dates. And I don't know how that is even vaguely healthy. Just because it is a natural sugar does not mean it is healthy. I think it's really completely mislabeling. I think people like the Primal Pantry really need to look at what they've got, what they're putting in things, because actually there's far, you could almost, if you compared that to a Mars bar, you've actually probably not got much difference in terms of the way that the body sees it. Huge amounts of fructose for no real benefit or good reason. Anyway, the key thing is that we tend to have a lot of those and justify it because of the training. So actually, thinking about time-restricted eating, it's not to say that you can eat whatever you want, but what it tends to do is it allows you to almost eat more what would be construed as unhealthy food, because it gives you more time to repair and recover outside of that. So that's what they showed in this study, is actually when they changed some of these mice that had this shortened window onto a high-fat diet, they still remained lean, even compared to the mice that were eating a very supposedly good diet or a normal mouse diet, but could eat any time they wanted. And that's the critical thing, is that actually it seemed to protect against the metabolic changes, because we're starting to understand now that maybe obesity isn't about necessarily the metabolic, or say the actual intake of calories. It could be related to the fact that the intake of calories is driven by disordinance in the fat tissue and various other areas, and it could actually be a hormonal thing, which means that we're not sensing how much energy we actually need, causing us to taking energy more than we actually need. So I'm going to leave that there. That's a good little introduction on where time-restricted feeding may be really productive for athletes. Let me know how you get on with these things, any other questions you want to ask, and I'll hopefully be able to address them in future podcasts. Hope you've enjoyed listening. Thank you very much, and goodbye.